Late April 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing. Soviet forces pushed from the east, American and British forces advanced from the west, and the German Reich lay in ruins. Across a continent, military units discovered something that would reshape the world's understanding of science, medicine, and human rights. In hidden rooms attached to concentration camps, in sterile medical facilities disguised as hospitals, American soldiers found evidence of experiments conducted on human beings. These were not the chaotic records of a desperate regime. They were meticulous. They were organized. They were deliberate. At Camp Gusen in Austria, American soldiers of the 11th Armored Division arrived on May 7, 1945. The camp commandant had already fled. The guards had abandoned their posts. But the medical block remained intact. Inside, American medical officers and intelligence personnel found thousands of documents, files carefully organized in filing cabinets, photographs documenting procedures, laboratory equipment arranged as though the doctors had simply walked away moments before, the temperature records, vital signs measurements, detailed autopsy reports, all preserved with meticulous precision. Among the discovered files was a journal kept by a doctor named Hans Schroeder. The journal contained entries spanning 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. Each entry was dated. Each entry included temperature readings, time measurements, observations about subject reactions. The language was clinical, detached, scientific. Yet the procedures described were torture. On July 15, 1942, Schroeder wrote, Subject 47, female, age 23, Polish political prisoner, subjected to experimental surgery in both legs without anesthesia. Foreign materials introduced into muscle tissue. Objective, test infection progression rates and treatment response. Subject screamed throughout procedure. Pain level appears to exceed sedation alternatives. Proceeding as scheduled. The entry was written as though describing lab rats, not a human being. As though the screaming, the pain, the terror were merely data points to be recorded. This was the pattern throughout the file. Day after day. Entry after entry, a catalog of suffering presented with the emotional distance one might use to describe weather conditions or administrative statistics. When General Eisenhower learned these discoveries, he made a decision that would echo through history. He ordered every American military unit in the area to visit the camps. He invited journalists. He invited congressional delegations. He wanted the world to know exactly what had been found. He also understood something crucial. He knew that the Nazi regime would eventually attempt to deny these crimes. He knew that propaganda would emerge claiming exaggeration or fabrication. He knew that decades into the future, people might question whether such horrors had truly occurred. So he ordered meticulous documentation. Soldiers photographed everything. Cameras captured the medical equipment, the files, the surgical theaters. They photographed the survivors with their scars, their injuries, their traumatized expressions. They collected written testimony from survivors, while memories remained fresh. They preserved physical evidence with care. The documentation was not secondary to the liberation. It was essential, because liberation without evidence, compassion without documentation, rescue without record would eventually fade from public consciousness. But evidence preserved, photographed, filed, and protected could endure, could testify, could ensure that the truth would outlast denial. German prisoners of war who had been stationed near these camps, who had known about these facilities, who had perhaps convinced themselves that rumors exaggerated the truth, were now compelled to confront the evidence. They were ordered by American officers to enter the medical blocks. They were required to see the photographs. They were made to understand what had been done in the name of their nation. For many of these men, the moment represented a rupture in consciousness. Until that point, they had existed in a state of carefully maintained denial. They had rationalized, justified, minimized. They had told themselves stories about orders, about necessity, about the greater good. But confronted with documentation this thorough, this systematic, this impossible to deny, the mental structures they had built began to collapse. On May 9th, 1945, a group of German prisoners of war was assembled by American officers outside the medical facility at Camp Gusen. The The prisoners had served as guards or support personnel at the camp. They range in age from 18 to 55. Some were Wehrmacht regular army. Some had been conscripted late in the war. Some had been Schutzstaffel. They had varied levels of awareness about what occurred in the medical block. Some claimed later they had known nothing. Some admitted they had suspected. Some confessed they had actively participated. The American officer in charge, Captain Robert Mitchell, a physician from Boston, explained what would happen. You will enter this facility. You will examine the documentation. You will view the photographs. You will see what your nation conducted. You will remain silent. You will not speak. You will simply look. You will absorb what you see. Then you will return. There will be questions. You will answer them. The prisoners entered. The first room contained photographs, black and white images showing surgical procedures, images showing scarred limbs, mutilated bodies, evidence of experimental work. The photographs were not artistic or elevated in any way. They were medical documentation. They were clinical. They were undeniable. One man, a guard named Helmut Fischer, who had served at the camp for 2 years, fell silent the moment he saw the first photograph. His face changed. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. He simply stared. Other men moved to the photographs more slowly, processing what they witnessed. Some appeared to be counting, as if the number of photographs might somehow make the evidence less real. Some studied details, as if examining the images carefully might reveal that they were falsified, that they were propaganda, that they were somehow not what they appeared to be. The next room contained the documents. File cabinets lined the walls. American personnel had arranged samples on tables. Medical records, autopsy reports, temperature charts, surgical diagrams showing precisely where incisions had been made, daily entries describing procedures and results. Some of the records were handwritten. Some were typed. All were organized with systematic precision. An officer explained the documents. These are original records, recovered from German military files, written by German doctors, in German language, describing experiments conducted on prisoners held in this facility. Approximately 234 documented procedures across 3 years. Fewer than half the subjects survived. The documents were no longer theory or rumor or propaganda. They were primary source material. They were written in the perpetrator's own language. They contained details that only someone present could have included. They contained drawings and measurements that demonstrated planning and intent. A prisoner named Klaus Hoffmann, who had been a medical orderly at the facility, began to weep when he saw a specific document. He recognized the handwriting. He recognized the signature at the bottom of the page. The document was a request for additional test subjects, signed by the chief medical officer and countersigned by Hoffmann himself. His signature was there. His name, his explicit participation in the formal request for human beings to torture. Another prisoner, Ernst Muller, who had insisted after the war that he had merely followed orders and had never known the true nature of the experiments, was confronted with a document signed by him. The document was a request for supplies for the medical block. The supplies listed included items with no medical use, items designed specifically for inducing pain or immobilizing subjects. The document included a note in Muller's own handwriting explaining the intended use of certain devices. He had known. There was no plausible denial. There was no possible rationalization. The evidence was comprehensive. The evidence was primary source. The evidence was in the prisoner's own language, in their own handwriting, bearing their own signatures. The photographs continued. Images of survivors. Images showing the permanent damage inflicted. Images showing young people, many in their 20s, with scarred, mutilated limbs. Some prisoners were missing fingers. Some had burn marks covering their bodies. Some bore scars from surgical procedures that had served no medical purpose. One set of photographs showed a group of Polish women. The caption identified them as subjects who had undergone surgical procedures designed to simulate battlefield wounds. The photograph showed young women, healthy before the war, now permanently damaged. One woman, identified only as patient 12 in the medical records but named Maria in other documents, was shown before and after photographs. The before image showed a young woman smiling at the camera, healthy, normal, at peace. The after image showed the same woman, but transformed. Scarred legs, cautious posture, eyes that had experienced trauma. The contrast was absolute. It demonstrated that these were not laboratory animals or abstract research subjects. They were human beings who had existed before the experiments. They had been changed forever. Many of the German prisoners fell silent during the viewing, not from resistance or defiance, but from the overwhelming recognition of what had been done and their own complicity through knowledge or inaction or active participation. The silence was profound. It was not the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone whose mental structures had shattered, whose worldview had been destroyed, whose sense of national identity had been demolished by incontrovertible evidence presented by representatives of the enemy nation they had been taught to despise. The enemy had liberated victims. The enemy had treated the injured with care. The enemy was now showing them evidence in their own language, bearing their own signatures, documenting their own crimes. The moral universe had inverted, and in that inversion, the prisoners were forced to confront the depth of the evil that their own nation had perpetrated in their own names. After viewing the documentation and photographs, the German prisoners of war were led to another section of the facility. Here, the American medical personnel had established a care station. In rooms that had once served as recovery areas for experiment subjects, American nurses and doctors were now treating survivors. The prisoners were ordered to observe, to witness, to understand what liberation looked like when contrasted with what they had participated in or enabled through their silence. The first patient they saw was a woman identified in the medical records as Maria Kusmierczuk, Polish national, arrested in Warsaw in 1942 for resistance activity, sentenced to indefinite detention and medical experimentation. She lay on a clean bed with fresh sheets. American medical personnel surrounded her with care. Her legs were bandaged with professional precision. Intravenous fluids ran into her arm, providing hydration and medication for infection. A nurse, Captain Sarah Cohen from Philadelphia, sat beside Maria's bed, holding her hand, speaking softly in broken Polish that she had learned from military language training. Maria had undergone surgical experiments designed to simulate battlefield wounds. Scalpels had been used to create deep incisions in both legs. Foreign materials had been deliberately introduced into the wounds. Bacteria cultures had been injected to study infection progression. She had suffered fever, agony, the physical impossibility of movement. For months after procedures, she had been confined to a medical barracks where German doctors had continued to observe her deterioration. The pain had been constant. The infection had been life-threatening. She had expected to die. Instead, American soldiers had arrived. American medics had treated her wounds with antibiotics now available through American production capacity. American nurses had provided pain medication derived from American pharmaceutical development. American doctors had examined her injuries and developed a treatment protocol to save her life and preserve what function remained in her damaged legs. Captain Cohen explained to the German prisoners exactly what she was doing as she worked. When I clean this wound, I am removing dead tissue and infection. The infection is from the deliberately contaminated incisions made during Nazi medical procedures. When I apply this medication, I am using antibiotics developed by American researchers and manufactured by American industry. When I give her fluids, I am providing nutrition that American food production makes possible. She will live. Her legs will retain limited function. She will walk again, though with difficulty. She will have chronic pain. This is the damage your nation inflicted. This is what American medicine is attempting to repair. One German prisoner, a medic named Friedrich Weber who had assisted in some of the experiments, broke down completely. He sank to his knees. He could not breathe. The contrast was too absolute. He had participated in inflicting this suffering. He had told himself it was medical science. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself that causing pain in the service of gathering data was acceptable. But confronted with American nurses treating the same patients with gentleness, with skill, with genuine concern for their recovery and their dignity, the justifications crumbled. The prisoners were then taken to another room where more survivors were being treated. A young man, identified in Nazi medical records as Subject 37, had been subjected to freezing experiments. He had been placed in ice water for extended periods. Scientists had timed how long he could survive as his body temperature dropped. They had recorded his vital signs as consciousness faded. He had been removed moments before death would have been certain. He survived the initial experiment, but his extremities had suffered severe frostbite. By the time American forces arrived, his hands and feet were gangrenous. Amputation had been necessary. He had been a coal miner in Bohemia before the war. His hands had defined his identity. His hands had been his livelihood. His hands had been his capability. The Nazis had destroyed them in the name of science. Now American surgeons, skilled and careful, were fitting him with prosthetics. The work was meticulous. The goal was not to restore what had been lost, because that was impossible, but to restore what function could be achieved. The young man was learning to use his new hands. The process was painful. The progress was slow. But an American prosthetist was working with him, teaching him, providing encouragement. The German prisoners watched this work in stunned silence. They witnessed the investment of American medical expertise, American materials, American time, and American compassion being directed toward healing victims of crimes committed by Nazi Germany. The contrast was devastating. It raised an unavoidable question. If we had treated these prisoners the way Americans are now treating them, what would have happened? If we had applied medical skill to healing instead of harming, if we had focused on recovery instead of destruction, if we had recognized the humanity in these captives instead of viewing them as experimental material, what would the outcome have been? There was no comfortable answer. The answer was that they had chosen differently. They had chosen torture. They had chosen to view human beings as research subjects rather than people. They had chosen to inflict suffering in the name of science. They had chosen wrong. And the evidence of their choosing wrong was displayed before them in the form of patients being healed, survivors being cared for, the broken being made whole to the extent that healing could achieve. An American officer explained the medical and philosophical principles underlying the American approach. Every person has inherent dignity. Every person has rights that cannot be violated regardless of circumstances. A person under military detention, under imprisonment, under any form of custody, retains a right to be treated as a human being. These principles are now being established in international law through what will be called the Nuremberg Code. That code will state explicitly that the voluntary consent of research subjects is absolutely essential, that experiments must yield beneficial results unobtainable by other means, that proper medical facilities and preparations are required to protect subjects, that subjects retain the right to withdraw from experiments at any time, that researchers are responsible for ending experiments if harm occurs, that only qualified scientists can conduct research, and most fundamentally, that certain actions are wrong regardless of orders, regardless of potential benefits, regardless of who the subjects are. These principles are being written now. In response to what was found in this facility and others like it across occupied Europe, your nation did not follow these principles. Your nation rejected them. Your nation created the conditions that made necessary the creation of these principles. The German prisoners heard these words. They understood what was being communicated. They were being told that the international community, led by the United States and its allies, was fundamentally reshaping the understanding of what medical research could and could not do. They were being told that their nation's actions would henceforth define what must never happen again. They were being told that they had participated in or enabled or witnessed something so profound in its violation of human rights that would require global legal reconstruction to prevent repetition. The German prisoners of war were then assembled in what had been the medical director's office. The walls were lined with filing cabinets. The desk held stacks of documents, and standing before them was an American officer who would conduct formal interviews. Each prisoner would be asked specific questions. Each would be recorded. Each would provide testimony that would be collected, documented, and eventually used in war crimes trials. The first prisoner called was Ernst Muller, the man whose handwriting appeared on supply request documents. He was asked to stand before the documents. He was asked to read his own signature. He was asked to explain what the document meant. His hands trembled. His voice broke. He attempted to claim that he had not understood the true purpose of the supplies. He attempted to claim that he had been following orders without comprehension. But the American officer confronted him with another document. This one was a memo written in Mahler's handwriting, explaining in specific detail what certain equipment was intended for. The equipment was for restraining subjects. The document explained that the restraints needed to be particularly secure because subjects undergoing certain procedures would struggle violently. Muller had known. His attempt at denial collapsed. His confession followed. He wept as he admitted participation in preparing the facility for experiments he now understood were torture. Another prisoner, Helmut Fischer, the guard who had fallen silent upon seeing the first photograph, was asked to explain what he had witnessed during his 2 years of service at the camp. He described guards bringing prisoners to the medical block. He described hearing screams from the surgical theaters. He described seeing prisoners removed from the facility on stretchers, sometimes alive, but often not. He described the systematic nature of the operations. He described how the entire camp had known that something horrific was occurring in the medical block. He described how officers had explicitly instructed guards not to ask questions, not to investigate, not to inquire about the nature of the experiments. He described how the institutional structure of the military camp had been organized specifically to prevent anyone from independently verifying or questioning what occurred in the medical block. He described how this silence, this deliberate avoidance of knowledge, had enabled the experiments to continue. When asked directly if he bore responsibility for what had happened, Fischer answered with devastating honesty, "I am not a doctor. I did not perform the experiments. But I stood guard at doors behind which I knew torture was occurring. I accepted the orders not to question. I accepted the explanation that security required my ignorance. I accepted the comfort of not knowing what I could have investigated. I chose ignorance over truth. I chose obedience over conscience. I chose safety over humanity. I bear responsibility, not equal responsibility to those who conducted the experiments, but responsibility nonetheless." The American officer documented every word, every confession, every admission, every moment of recognition that ordinary people in ordinary positions had enabled extraordinary evil through their silence, their complicity, their choice to accept convenient lies rather than confront difficult truths. The interrogations continued for hours. Each prisoner provided pieces of the puzzle. Each confirmed aspects of the systematic organization of the experiments. Each provided names of doctors. Each identified officers who had authorized the work. Each contributed to the evidentiary record that would eventually be presented at the Nuremberg trials. One prisoner, Klaus Hoffmann, the medical orderly who had recognized his own handwriting on a document requesting additional test subjects, was asked to explain his motivation. Why had he signed such a document? Why had he participated in requesting that human beings be provided for experimentation? His response was stark. Because I was afraid. Because I was young. Because I believed that refusing orders would result in my death or imprisonment. Because I had been taught that certain people were less than human, and therefore their suffering was acceptable. Because I told myself that if I did not participate directly, then I bore no responsibility. Because I wanted to survive the war. All of these reasons, none of them sufficient, all of them inadequate, all of them the explanations that ordinary people provide when asked why they participated in extraordinary evil. The German prisoners, through these interrogations, were forced into a form of moral reckoning that many would spend the remainder of their lives attempting to process. They had been presented with evidence, undeniable primary source, in their own language, bearing their own signatures. They had witnessed American medical personnel healing the victims of crimes that they themselves had enabled. They had been interrogated and forced to provide confessions and admissions, and they had begun to understand something fundamental about the nature of moral responsibility and the impossibility of hiding from the consequences of one's choices through the comfort of ignorance or the excuse of following orders. The evidence collected by American forces at Camp Gusen and dozens of other facilities across liberated Europe became the foundation for what would be known as the Nuremberg Doctors Trial. The trial began on December 9, 1946, more than a year after the end of the war. 23 defendants were charged. 20 of them were physicians. The prosecution was led by Brigadier General Telford Taylor, an American military lawyer who had previously served on the prosecution team for the main Nuremberg trials. The trial took place in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. The courtroom was equipped with simultaneous translation equipment that allowed testimony in multiple languages. Journalists from around the world attended. Photographers documented every session. The proceedings were filmed. Nothing would be hidden. Nothing would be forgotten. The photographs that had silenced German prisoners of war months earlier were now presented as evidence before international judges. The documents bearing German signatures in German handwriting were entered into the official record. The testimony of survivors was heard and recorded. The trial created an unprecedented historical archive. The first witness called by the prosecution was an American physician, Dr. Andrew Ivy, who served as the prosecution's expert on medical ethics. He testified about the principles that govern ethical medical research. He explained the concept of informed consent. He detailed the requirement that research subjects must be volunteers who fully understand the risks and benefits of participation. He described the obligation of researchers to minimize harm and maximize benefit. He established a baseline against which Nazi medical practices would be judged. Then the prosecution called survivors. Maria Kusmierczuk, the Polish woman who had undergone experimental surgeries, testified. She described being taken from her cell without explanation. She described being strapped to a surgical table. She described the deliberate infliction of pain without anesthesia. She described the infections that followed. She described the permanent damage to her legs. She described the psychological trauma that continued long after liberation. Her testimony was translated from Polish to English and German. Every word was documented. Every detail was recorded. The defendants sat and listened. Some took notes. Some stared straight ahead with blank expressions. Some attempted to appear unmoved. But the cumulative weight of testimony from survivor after survivor made denial impossible. Another survivor, a young man identified in trial documents as Vladimir Novak, testified about freezing experiments. He described being placed in tanks of ice water while doctors measure how long he could survive. He described watching other prisoners die during these experiments. He described the pain of frostbite as his extremities froze. He described waking up after rescue to discover that his hands had been amputated. He held up his prosthetic hands as he testified. The visual impact was undeniable. The defense attorneys attempted to argue that the experiments had been conducted for legitimate medical purposes. They attempted to argue that the doctors had been following orders from military and political authorities. They attempted to argue that wartime conditions created different standards for medical research. Every argument was systematically demolished by the prosecution. The prosecution presented expert testimony demonstrating that the experiments had no scientific value. Control groups were absent or poorly designed. Variables were not properly managed. Results were often not even recorded. The experiments had been exercises in cruelty disguised by scientific language, but lacking any scientific rigor. The prosecution also presented documentary evidence proving that the experiments had been voluntary initiatives by the doctors, not mandatory orders from superiors. Letters between doctors and administrators showed requests to conduct experiments, not orders to comply with experiments. The doctors had chosen to participate. They had chosen to design the procedures. They had chosen to inflict the harm. The testimony of German prisoners of war who had witnessed the experiments was also entered into evidence. Helmut Fischer, the guard who had described hearing screams from the surgical theaters, testified about the systematic organization of the experimental facilities. Ernst Muller, whose signature appeared on supply requisitions, testified about his role in providing equipment for restraining subjects. Klaus Hoffmann, the medical orderly, testified about his participation in selecting subjects and preparing them for procedures. Each testimony added detail to the historical record. Each testimony demonstrated that the experiments had not been isolated incidents conducted by rogue individuals. They had been systematic programs involving dozens of personnel across multiple camps over multiple years. The scale was undeniable. The organization was undeniable. The intent was undeniable. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from a letter written by Dr. Sigmund Rascher to Heinrich Himmler, head of the Schutzstaffel. The letter, dated February 17, 1943, requested permission to conduct additional freezing experiments. The letter casually mentioned that previous experiments had resulted in numerous deaths. The letter asked for additional subjects to be provided. The tone was bureaucratic, administrative, utterly devoid of any recognition that the subjects were human beings. The letter was read aloud in court. The prosecution asked the court to note the language used. The letter referred to subjects as materials, as resources, as supplies to be requisitioned. The dehumanization was explicit and documented in the perpetrator's own words. The trial lasted from December 1946 to August 1947. The judgment was delivered on August 20th, 1947. 16 defendants were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. 9 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 7 were acquitted. The sentences were carried out at Landsberg prison. On June 2nd, 1948, 7 Nazi doctors were executed. The executions were documented. Photographs were taken. The historical record was preserved. But the most lasting impact of the trial was not the punishments imposed on individual defendants. The most lasting impact was the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 principles governing medical research ethics that emerged directly from the trial proceedings. The code was written by American doctors and lawyers working with the prosecution. It was based on American values about individual rights and human dignity. It represented American ideals about the proper relationship between science and ethics. The first principle of the Nuremberg Code stated, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." This meant that no person could be subjected to medical experimentation without freely giving informed consent. No prisoner, no child, no person incapable of understanding what participation would entail. The principle was revolutionary because it established that certain actions are wrong regardless of potential benefits, regardless of who the subjects are, regardless of orders or circumstances. Subsequent principles address the scientific validity of experiments, the requirement for proper facilities to protect subjects, the responsibility of researchers to minimize harm, the right of subjects to withdraw at any time, and the obligation of researchers to terminate experiments if harm becomes evident. The principles were comprehensive. They were specific. They were grounded in the recognition that the Nazi experiments had violated every standard of human decency, and that preventing repetition required explicit legal and ethical frameworks. The German prisoners of war who had witnessed the evidence months earlier now saw that evidence transformed into international law. They saw their own testimony used to convict perpetrators. They saw American prosecutors and judges establish principles that would govern medical research worldwide for generations. They saw, in the starkest possible terms, how the nation they had served had been judged by the international community and found guilty of crimes so profound that entirely new legal categories had to be created to address them. Years after the war, after the trials, after the verdicts, the German prisoners of war who had witnessed the photographs from the secret lab rooms carried a memory with them into civilian life. Some returned to destroyed cities. Some found families that no longer existed. Some attempted to rebuild lives in a nation that was itself being rebuilt from rubble and ruins. Friedrich Weber, the medic who had collapsed when confronted with American nurses treating the victims he had helped create, settled in Bavaria after his release from Allied custody in 1948. He found work as a clerk. He married. He raised children. But he could not forget. In 1963, 18 years after the war ended, Weber began writing a memoir. He did not intend to publish it. He wrote for himself, attempting to process guilt that had not diminished with time. The manuscript, discovered after his death in 1989, provided insight into the psychological state of men who had been forced to confront their complicity. Weber wrote, "I participated in creating suffering that American medical personnel then attempted to repair. I watched them work. I saw the gentleness, the skill, the genuine concern. I understood in that moment that everything I had believed was false. Everything I had been taught about racial hierarchy, about the inferiority of certain peoples, about the acceptability of using prisoners for medical advancement. All of it was lies. The proof was American nurses treating Polish prisoners with more humanity than German doctors had shown. The proof was visible. The proof was undeniable. I have lived with this knowledge for decades. It has shaped every choice I have made since. It has defined my understanding of morality. It has convinced me that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when ideology provides justification and authority provides permission. Helmut Fischer, the guard who had fallen silent upon viewing the first photograph, also wrote about his experiences. His account, written in 1972 and donated to a German historical archive, described a moment when silence became his only response to undeniable evidence. He wrote, "Silence was not a choice. Silence was a collapse of all capacity to respond. When confronted with evidence that your nation, your leaders, people who shared your language and culture, people you were taught to trust and obey, when confronted with evidence that these people conducted systematic torture, your mental structures break. You cannot speak because words require a framework of meaning, and that framework has been demolished. I stood silent because everything I might have said, every justification, every excuse, every rationalization, had been rendered absurd by photographs showing exactly what had been done." Ernst Muller, whose signature appeared on supplied documents, struggled for the remainder of his life with the recognition that his bureaucratic participation had enabled atrocities. He never wrote a memoir. He rarely spoke about the war. But his son, in an interview conducted in 2003, described his father's state of mind. "My father carried guilt that never diminished. He believed he deserved punishment beyond what Allied authorities had imposed. He believed that his choice to sign documents, to fulfill administrative functions, to be a cog in a machine, made him complicit in crimes he had not directly committed but had enabled. He taught his children that following orders is not a moral defense, that bureaucratic distance from consequences does not eliminate responsibility. That knowledge creates obligation. These lessons defined our family. These lessons define the values he passed to the next generation." Klaus Hoffmann, the medical orderly who had recognized his own handwriting on a document requesting test subjects, became an educator after the war. He taught history at a secondary school in Stuttgart. He focused particularly on teaching about the Holocaust and the medical experiments. He brought survivors to speak to his students. He showed them the same photographs that had silenced them decades earlier. He wanted the next generation to understand that ordinary people in ordinary positions could enable extraordinary evil through small choices, through bureaucratic compliance, through choosing not to question. In 1978, Hoffman gave a lecture at the school where he taught. The lecture was recorded and later transcribed. In it, he spoke directly about his experience viewing the photographs in 1945. He said, "When American officers showed us photographs from the medical facility, I experienced what I can only describe as a shattering of self-concept. I had believed myself to be a decent person. I had believed that I was simply doing my job, following orders, surviving the war. But the photographs revealed that my work, my orders, my survival had been purchased through the suffering of innocent people. The Americans did not need to punish us. The photographs punished us. The evidence punished us. Our own signatures on documents punished us. The recognition of what we had enabled punished us. And that punishment has continued every day since." The German prisoners of war were not the only ones affected by witnessing the evidence. American soldiers and officers who participated in liberation and documentation also carried the experience with them. Captain Robert Mitchell, the physician from Boston who had led German prisoners through the medical facility at Camp Gusen, returned to the United States in 1946. He resumed his medical practice. He specialized in trauma surgery, but he never stopped thinking about what he had seen in Europe. In a letter to his wife written in 1961 and preserved in family archives, Mitchell reflected on his experiences. He wrote, "I believed I understood human evil from treating battlefield injuries. I was wrong. Battlefield injuries result from combat. They result from soldiers attempting to kill other soldiers in the context of war. What I saw in the concentration camp medical facilities was different. It was a deliberate infliction of suffering on defenseless prisoners for no valid purpose. It was torture disguised as science. It was barbarism dressed in medical terminology. Showing the evidence to German prisoners was necessary. They needed to see. They needed to understand. They needed to confront what had been done in their nation's name. But I also needed them to see how American medical personnel responded. I needed them to see that healing was possible, that compassion was real, that even after experiencing such evil, humanity could reassert itself through care, through treatment, through the simple act of recognizing that every person, regardless of what has been done to them, retains inherent dignity and deserves medical attention. These reflections, both from German prisoners and American liberators, demonstrate the lasting psychological and moral impact of the moment when photographs from secret lab rooms silenced those who saw them. The silence was not merely emotional shock. It was a recognition that certain truths are so profound, so devastating, so absolute that they render speech inadequate. The photographs documented crimes, but they also documented the moral distance between two approaches to humanity. One approach that viewed people as experimental material, and another approach that viewed even the most brutalized victims as human beings worthy of care, dignity, and justice. The photographs from the secret laboratory rooms at Camp Gusen remained in American military archives after 1945. They were preserved carefully, stored in climate-controlled facilities, protected from degradation. Decades passed. Decades became generations. The photographs that had silenced German prisoners of war in 1945 became educational materials for medical schools, for human rights organizations, for Holocaust museums, for anyone seeking to understand the depths of human cruelty and the possibilities of human compassion in response. The Nuremberg Code, born directly from the trial of Nazi doctors, fundamentally reshaped how the world understood medical research and human rights. The Code's principles, articulated by American legal scholars and physicians, became foundational to international medical ethics. Other nations adopted similar principles. Other organizations, including the United Nations, built upon the Nuremberg Code to create broader frameworks for human rights protection. The World Medical Association created the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, a statement of ethical principles for medical research that was based directly on the principles established at Nuremberg. The code spread globally. It influenced how medical schools taught ethics. It shaped how institutional review boards evaluated research proposals. It established that informed consent was not merely advisable, but absolutely essential. No research institution in the developed world could conduct human subject research without approval from an ethics board. No researcher could proceed without ensuring that subjects fully understood the risks and benefits of participation. The Nuremberg Code transformed from a response to specific atrocities into a living framework that shaped medical practice for generations. In the United States, the ethical principles articulated at Nuremberg influenced the development of federal regulations governing human subjects research. When scandals emerged in the 1970s, such as the revelation of the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which African American men had been deliberately left untreated to observe disease progression, critics explicitly referenced the Nuremberg Code. The comparison to Nazi experimentation generated outrage that led to legislative action. The National Research Act of 1974 established a requirement for institutional review boards and formalized the principles of informed consent and risk minimization. The Nuremberg Code was also foundational to the creation of Holocaust memorials and museums. When survivors began establishing institutions to preserve the historical record of genocide and medical experimentation, the photographs from Camp Gusen and similar facilities became central exhibits. Visitors to these museums could see the same evidence that had silenced German prisoners decades earlier. They could witness the photographs, read the documents, understand the scale of the crimes. The museums served a pedagogical purpose. They taught new generations about the consequences of allowing ideology to override ethical responsibility. They demonstrated how ordinary people in ordinary positions could enable extraordinary evil. They showed how American liberators had responded with care and documentation rather than revenge. One particularly significant museum exhibit, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, incorporated the Camp Gusen photographs into its permanent collection. The photographs are displayed alongside explanatory text that describes the experiments, names of victims, identifies the perpetrators, and documents the American liberation and subsequent trials. Millions of visitors have seen these photographs. They have confronted the evidence that silenced German prisoners of war. They have been forced to consider what they would have done in similar circumstances. The photographs from the secret laboratory rooms also influenced how the world understood the connection between ideology and atrocity. Scholars studying the Holocaust, studying genocide, studying crimes against humanity, have used these photographs as evidence of how Nazi racial ideology transformed educated professionals into perpetrators of systematic torture. The photographs demonstrate that evil is not a failure of education or intelligence. The Nazi doctors were highly trained, widely published, respected members of the medical profession before they participated in atrocities. The photographs demonstrate that ideology combined with institutional authority and the dehumanization of certain populations creates conditions under which ordinary moral standards are suspended. The lessons drew from these photographs and from the experiences of those who witnessed them have been taught in schools throughout the world. The Nuremberg Code has been translated into dozens of languages. Its principles have been incorporated into laws of nations that did not directly participate in World War II. The Code has become foundational to how humanity understands the relationship between scientific advancement and ethical responsibility. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the photographs and the silence they produced was the establishment of a principle that certain actions are wrong regardless of circumstances. The Nuremberg Code established that no potential benefit to science or society could justify research on unwilling subjects, no military necessity, no scientific advancement, no public health benefit. The principle was revolutionary in 1947. It remains radical today. It means that some things cannot be done regardless of their potential value. It means that human dignity must take precedence over scientific curiosity. It means that individuals possess rights that cannot be violated even for the greater good. German prisoners of war who had fallen silent when confronted with photographs from secret laboratory rooms had witnessed the establishment of a new international legal and ethical order. They had seen their nation judged for violating principles that had not yet been articulated when the crimes were committed. They had seen American prosecutors and judges establish frameworks that would govern human behavior for generations. They had understood that their participation in or complicity with these crimes would define them for the remainder of their lives. Their silence in that moment in 1945, confronted with undeniable evidence, represented the moment when the world looked at atrocity and resolved that it must never happen again. The silence was not acceptance. It was not resignation. It was the sound of a collective moral awakening. It was a moment when humanity recognized what it was capable of and committed to preventing repetition through explicit legal frameworks, ethical standards, and international cooperation. The photographs that produced that silence continue to speak decades after men who saw them in 1945 have passed away. They speak through museums and memorials. They speak through textbooks and educational materials. They speak through the policies and procedures that govern medical research in every nation that has adopted the Nuremberg Code. They speak through the lives of survivors who lived to bear witness. They speak through the conscience of humanity, reminding each generation of the consequences of allowing ideology to override ethics, of permitting authority to eliminate individual moral responsibility, of viewing certain people as less than human. The German prisoners of war who fell silent when shown photographs from the secret laboratory rooms at Camp Gusen left no permanent written record of that moment beyond what American interrogators documented and what they later revealed in memoirs and interviews. But their silence itself was a historical document. It was testimony to the power of evidence, to the impossibility of denying documented atrocity, to the moral awakening that occurs when ideology collides with documented reality. In that silence, the world found its voice. In that silence, the foundation was laid for a new understanding of human rights, medical ethics, and international law. In that silence, the beginning of a better world constructed from the ashes of a world that had permitted extraordinary evil